We'll discuss about notions of peace and pacifism. Like, are they the same? Are they different? And we will discuss them step by step via a historical evolution, how they were perceived and talked about in Germany. So we can start here. It's a bit of a boring first slide, but I think it's sometimes important to get the notions right. So if I may just ask you, like, spontaneously right now, if you like, what do the notions of pacifism and peace, like, what kind of associations do they create in your mind? Someone who would like to start?
If I think of pacifism, I have the image of someone wearing a flower crown and being very kind to everyone and saying, "Oh, please, I'm just a peaceful soul, and I try to avoid any kind of conflict."
Yeah, for me, as a soldier, the difference is that pacifism is about denying the existence of the military. It's like we don't need it. And peace is more broad word, I would say. Like, I can fight with my arms, my rifle, literally, and it's still be in times of peace. But I cannot be a pacifist in the same way.
Right, yeah, I mean, your two answers, in a way, they made me evoke what is also written here, principle or idea above all else. It's like we have this sort of feel-good attitude. We believe that what we are doing is good, and the end result, well, intentions are most important. Anyone disagreeing with these thoughts?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Because pacifism is a noun, and there's a verb to pacify.
It is, yes.
And I'm just curious, because what do we do in order to pacify this surrounding?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really interesting thought which you brought up here, because, I mean, not even going too much into details, I think whilst we may think of pacifists as positively minded people, pacify doesn't have this positive note at all. Yeah. So, as in, yeah, I would bring in two dimensions here. So, one was mentioned already by both of you. Pacifism, I would generally rather identify with a certain attitude, with a philosophical approach. Peace is more like an end state. I mean, you could say peace-oriented, which makes it closer, but that's the difference. And another second dimension, which I think is important here, and maybe someone could also just very quickly disclose to us what he thinks about it, the difference between deontological and consequentialist ethics. Any idea? Yeah. It's basically, I mean, it's like a philosophical scheme which is being used very, very often. The idea is actually quite simple. So deontological ethics mean that, just like you and you said, you have a certain idea and a principle which is more important than anything else. So say, for instance, just a banal, strange example, but say we live in a society where no passenger is ever allowed to cross the street, even if you could save someone's lives. This would be an example of deontological ethics, whereas consequentialist ethics would mean, like a hardcore consequentialist ethics notion, would mean that if you can achieve a positive aim, however you define it, you may do all kinds of stuff, like possibly even lying or whatsoever. Like, the principle and notion itself is not so important, but the end state. And prior to this meeting, I thought that pacifism is always a purely deontological perspective. Some scholars disagree with this, and they introduce absolute and conditional pacifism. But I would say that, again, if you have a different perspective on this, feel free, but in our public discourse, the way we use the notion, or when someone speaks about, oh, these are pacifists, we usually tend to apply deontological thinking. So these two dimensions are, I mean, they might seem purely theoretical right now, but we will see throughout during the presentation why they are sometimes indeed quite important. So This is a picture from 1907, the Munich Peace Conference, also called back then as the Second Hague Conference. And yeah, it's question to you again. If you think about pacifist or pro-peace ideas, do you think there's a specific historical era, epoch where they emerged really strongly? Have they always been there? What are your ideas on this?
After the Great War, maybe, after the First World War, maybe good, and of course, the grand narrative of it, maybe after the First World War.
Any other ideas?
Yeah,
okay.
In general, they appear in the public spaces after the major wars, whether the First or Second World War, or any major conflict. Like cantonment swing back to if the First World War was named the mother of all wars, then there was a discussion after the war that we should not have this situation again. So therefore, some Pacific movements were kind of created here and there, and similarly also after the Second World War, although then there came also a cultural revolution, to which I think you referred in terms of flowers and the image of pacifism that probably some of us have as a stereotype.
Right. Yeah, you brought up a number of notions which we'll discuss later on. But yeah, it's definitely very, very interesting. I would say like this. If we look at it from a purely historical perspective, certainly pacifist movements have always existed, more or less. But the true heyday of pacifism, as we understand it today, really took place, grew to prominence after the Second World War. There's a number of factors for this, which we can discuss and actually speculate about. So before World War I, there was a so-called German Peace Society. I think it had its first meeting in 1892, if I recall correctly, but it had only around 10,000 members or so. So just a very narrow, dedicated group of idealists back then. But this was the time when empires were still fighting against each other, and there were indeed two Hague conferences, international peace conferences. In the first one, Germany did not attend. It did so in 1907. But back then, it was considered by other countries as not particularly cooperative, as it was still thinking about geopolitical power and the rise to hegemony. Of course, during wars, especially during World War I and World War II, pacifists were usually considered to be betrayers to the fatherland. And between the world wars, as you said, there was indeed an idea of never again. This was the time of Erich Maria Remarque and Im Westen nichts Neues. And various pacifist ideas, also a strong gender component. So the first sort of women feminist movement, they stressed that war is a perverted form of extreme masculinity. Today we would call it toxic masculinity, probably. But pacifism as a mass movement and as something that rang a bell for everyone, or at least for pundits and experts, really grew to prominence after the Second World War. Now the question is why? Your explanation points to a theory which back in the days was often referred as the theory of post-heroism. So it's this idea that societies go through a natural cycle where they first have a culture based on honor and expansion. They then commit war and engage in it, see how cruel it is, and this makes them sort of change their mind, more or less. There are also other factors involved. For instance, Professor Gunnar Heinsohn and Jack Foley from the CIA, they have actually formulated an idea based on demography. And it's not only demography, but it's strongly related to emancipatory ideas and educating women. Because what happens when you educate women and you have more free choice and freedom introduced in society, people can decide about their lives, and generally the birth rate goes down. When the birth rate goes down, you don't have these really massive families anymore where the mindset of canon fodder for the fatherland is much more difficult to implement because you only have your one son or one daughter, and right? So all kind of that. But yeah. And when we speak about pacifism in Germany, I wouldn't maybe say that the automatic, immediate equation is pacifism equals Friedensbewegung, so the peace movements. But these are the sort of pictures that most people get when they talk about pacifism in post-war history, like post-Second World War. And as we can see here, from a sociological, quantitative point of view, it grew to prominence in the 60s and 70s. But the first mass peace movement in Germany took place in spring 1958. Anyone has an idea why? Because this was the time, this was 3 years after Germany joined NATO, and the sort of arms race, Cold War style, already was taking on acceleration. And Germany officially agreed that it might help with nuclear arsenal, and its pilots may even carry nuclear arsenal in the name and as an objective considered by the US state. So that was, of course, kind of considered. This was the time when the notion of nie wieder, never again, started to be applied more and more and to be a hallmark in society's culture of remembrance and public discourse. The idea is that how can German flyers again have anything at all to do with nuclear arsenals and weaponry? And October 83, that was a reaction to the so-called NATO Doppelbeschluss. So in the 70s, generally the West and especially the US under Kissinger engaged in a policy which was named deterrent. And the idea was that if we, the West, start to get a bit easier on our weapon system, this will also take away stress and pressure from the Soviet leadership, i.e. we will have a golden cycle. One size decreases its weapon size and arsenal, and the other does so too. But what happened, of course, with the Soviets around 78 and 79, it did not act accordingly to these agreements. Nothing new, and probably also something which we can recognize today. And there was a huge discussion within the West, and especially in Germany. Helmut Schmidt was back then the chancellor, and his SPD party, like, you know what their attitudes oftentimes today is. Back then it was even way more radical. No fight, no land, it's the Ostpolitik, we have to engage with Russia. And Schmidt decided to get on with it and accept the Doppelbeschluss, so more weaponry for the West and installed in Germany. And he got ousted a year later. But yeah, this was the time when really those freedom peace movements, they were walking all over German cities. This was also a time of, I would say, atomically induced apocalypticism, the idea that we are just before to engage in a massive World War III, which will just basically perish the whole world. And what is also worth noting is that whilst most people would probably associate the Friedensbewegung with leftist ideas, there are solid grounds on which to make such a claim. They were actually quite diverse. Like there was, even if you think today on some AfD campaign posters, it is not by chance that they are also trying to kidnap the pacifist ideas right now, because there's also always a small wing of radical right-wing peace movements or peace ideas. And what is also really important, that is, like if you observe the German discourse as it has been performed since February 2022, much more so even before, you can tell how lasting a mark those Friedensbewegungen have left on German society and political elites. And now, we will watch a short clip. It will be in German, but no worries at all, because the main quote which I would like to discuss with you is then presented in English, but it's to capture the atmosphere back then and have a discussions on this. 1 second. It was working before, but that's the so-called Vorführ effect, as you say in Germany. So when you do something in front of everyone, it suddenly ceases to work. Okay, maybe we can do it just like this.
Hochrüstung ist das Overkill. Auschwitz ist unvergleichbar. Aber in mir, ich stehe auf 2 Grundsätzen. Nie wieder Krieg, nie wieder Auschwitz, nie wieder Völkermord, nie wieder Faschismus. Beides gehört bei mir zusammen, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde. Ja, und dann bekam ich ein paar Beutel aufs Ohr, da war ich so wirklich sowas von sauer.
Right. So, does anyone have any idea what kind of summit this was, when this took place, and what the whole context was? No? No one? Yeah, of course. That's why we're here for, to mutually inspire and learn from each other. Yes, this was indeed a very, very famous party summit in 1999 in Bielefeld. And it was the party summit of the Green Party. So that's a party which we have not mentioned at all thus far. But the Green Party, like when you discuss the Friedensbewegung and the peace movements, what we just did a second ago, it's actually it would be actually impossible to write a history of the Friedensbewegung without mentioning the Green Party. So the idea back then was that the mainstream political parties, as they existed back then, SPD, CDU, FDP, they were too stifled in their approach and were not able to be perceptive and receptive towards the idea of those new social movements. So radical pacifism, anti-nuclear war, radical pro-ecologism. And what happens if you have a massive, like a strong mass movement and no channels to transform this energy into official political institutions? A new political institutions comes into being, the Green Party. That was at the start of the 80s. And I think this is a point which sort of refers to our discussion about peace of pacifism, so pure attitude against the goal of peace with pragmatic means. Because what happened with the Green Party was some prominent members of them saw with their own eyes what was going on in ex-Yugoslavia. Among them, Marie-Louise Beck, who's also like one of the co-founders of Centrum Liberale Moderne, who in her own words described how she was hiding in Bosnia from incoming bombs. And this is the moment like this, in Jacques Lacanian psychoanalysis, you may call it the moment of the real. It's when your imagination, your ideas get confronted with raw reality. And this raw reality seems to contradict your ideas, and you have to find a new matrix to understand what is actually going on. And this party summit focused on Germany's decision to support the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia and Kosovo. And as you can see here, it was very, very controversial. In the end, it won, I think, by around 420 voices supported the idea, 318 were against, among them Claudia Roth. And I would like to discuss with you for a second the speech of Joschka Fischer, back then Minister of Foreign Affairs, in the name of the Greens. maybe take even a minute or so, read this quote there, and tell me what your first initial associations or ideas are.
Well, four elements, kind of two analysis, like what you're saying.
Exactly. And yes. So, sorry? Yes.
I guess someone had problem with counting.
Well, maybe, yes. This is a very likely hypothesis. But, question to you, like, do you think this is just a, like, arousing moment of, you know, of anxiety and of emerging emotions in front of a crowd, a really heated up atmosphere, or is there some more truth in these two principles?
Well, of course, some of those could be like much stuck together. So, like, two of those go together as one principle, and two of those, like, so the person is actually trying to implement, like, combining notions or sticking two notions together.
Mm-hmm.
Then in the end she has two, but...
Mm-hmm. In the German public discussion of this time back then, if you read through newspapers, a soft but I think important form of criticism has been raised over and over again towards the speech, mainly that whilst never again Auschwitz, never again genocide, never again fascism, easily tied to each other and can be seen as part of the same tree, it's much more problematic with regards to never again war. Because, for instance, with Auschwitz, how would you have to stop it if not by the means of war, by military intervention, or Rwandan genocide, or in fact Yugoslavia? What do you think of this criticism?
Well, there is a saying, never say never, and that's in the first place comes to what's happening is nowadays, because we also used to say never again, but we are having it again and again. And the question is, how do we stop this? And here I come back to the word pacify, because it's totally kind of negative in its connotation, but what do you do with the one who wants to wage a war?
Mm-hmm.
Do you just stand still? Then you have genocide.
Yeah.
Do you fight? And here begins the point of the discussion. What is pacifism? And I like what you said, is to pacify, it means to fight for peace. And fight is a negative word.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take the war out of the equation, you know, in general, and you say that you will never go to war, you are basically leaving your options helpless in some instances, as you mentioned, Rwanda, also Bosnia, at least until Srebrenica. So basically you are giving up on some of the scenarios. And the post-Cold War history, especially of the West, is filled with those instances that either we, as whether it was NATO or the US, we did too little or too much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can go for all, from Somalia to Haiti to Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Syria, you name it. So I think, you know, taking war in general, it is controversial.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you do if you kind of, you know, go with the war narrative too far? Then you are quote unquote war monger.
Mm-hmm.
You are pushing for fighting for peace, quote unquote. So it's a dilemma here where not only political but also ethical.
And it's also in a way, you can say it's the conflict between a kind of idealist state of a part of a movement and like realpolitik, like the struggle to find compromises to actually engage. I mean, this moment, like for many people, it's also called a kind of betrayal of the Greens, the
yes.
Green Party. So where they actually like stepped out of their also a pacifist, let's say, ghost or guys, spirit. His spirit, not ghost. And then actually started to become you could say, like more and more relevant party in the sense of a Regierungspartei, of the party also like taking responsibility for their actions in the government. But of course, as you mentioned, like then we have Iraq and we have Afghanistan, and suddenly we are in a field where all those decisions are like highly problematic, where it's not so easy to ethically like reason why this war, right? Why that war? Why this war not? And of course, like now we're coming back with Ukraine, like there's similar arguments raised at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Any other observations, comments, remarks?
Who threw this? It was like paint or something, was it like a knife? Or who threw something at the politician?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when you look at this party summit, you may think that the Green Party was extremely divided at this time, which it was, but this scenery overstates this case a little bit, because there were also many activists from around the Green Party, like more radical ecology activists or leftist activists. And the thing was that they already back then had their problems with the course that the Green Party was taking. And this was probably the official moment of divorce, just as you suggested. But it was, yeah, it was quite a strong hit. And actually, according to Joschka Fischer himself, he had problems hearing for the first few minutes. Yes. Mm. Yeah, so thanks a lot for your remarks. Like, I think we can maybe summarize it the following way. So we started our discussion with this distinction or the question whether pacifism and peace is the same. And I think, let me know if you have a different opinion, I'll be interested, but I think that when he says those two elements simply belong together, he actually says the Green Party, if it is truly interested in peace, it has to combine its ethos of avoiding war wherever possible with a more open-minded approach that sometimes this might, as sorry as it is, as much sorrow as it creates, at times this might be the only viable solution. And if you think about it, we could say never again war is the focus on the procedure, quote unquote. Never again Auschwitz, never again genocide, never again fascism is the focus on the desired end state. That's at least one way of formulating it. And you mentioned already that in the years ahead, back then, those kind of conflicting notions would over again rise to the surface and dominate public discourse. And that is indeed the case. I mean, whereas if, with regards to Afghanistan 2001, this intervention was supported by the UN, there was still some controversies around that, to be sure, but the majority of German public discourse was in support of it. Things changed with Iraq in 2003. Even though, according to George Bush and his memoirs, which he published in 2010, Gerhard Schröder apparently actually promised to him that he will support the Iraq war, but then he got notion of the political dynamics and the election campaign. But nevertheless, this was the time when even some, like, there were pundits or experts like Ian Burumer, who used to be a representative of this radical pacifist green movement. And he, for instance, was very critical against all those who opposed the war, claiming that they are still too, like, nostalgically attached to their previous ideas. Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014. This is, of course, like we are stepping here into a whole new universe, because that is not only the question of peace and pacifist ideas, but this is also the like German approach towards Russia and Eastern Europe in general. And more of this will be said during the following panels, of course, but in the 70s and 80s, when Germany heavily believed in its so-called Ostpolitik, so the idea was, again, let's, in Egon Bahr's words, who was one of the creators of this policy, Bad relationships with the Soviet Union and the GDR are better than no relationships at all. And the idea was to uphold dialogue, to engage in trade, and this famous notion of Wandel durch Handel, so evolution through trade. This was also this all kind of ideological ideas and intuitions come together, as this was also the time when people believe that more trade will integrate more countries into the international system and thus make war scenarios far less likely in the future. And it's worth noting that, for instance, when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, there was a lot of skepticism towards accepting Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, as you know. It was indeed the Germans and the French who blocked this decision. This was also a time that a few days after the war broke out, actually important German pundits and elites were celebrating in the Russian embassy in Berlin. So that is like a whole new notion. Like, of course, peace and pacifism are still very important ideas in this whole discourse, but they kind of join with a German perspective on Russia, which has really dominated foreign policy making in Germany for around 20, 30 years. And if you think about Ukraine 2014, I'm assuming that many of you might be dissatisfied with the way that German and parts of Western Europe discourse right now and look like, right? In terms of there's still so much hesitancy and there's endless debates about flying jacks and tanks, why Russia is bombing Ukrainian cities into smithereens. In 2014, that was a whole different story, much, much worse. There were still people like Alexander Rar, who's actually a Russian business lobbyist, who's always very strongly supportive of, again, Ostpolitik, and let's not be arrogant towards Russia. And these people were very prominent in the German press, so most public debates, even you can look it up on YouTube, the let's call them pure pro-Ukrainian side and anti-Ukrainian side were very much, usually equaled out, or even with a certain dominance of let's not anger Russia. So the current situation, I leave you to comment on this, whether you sort of agree with this assessment, which is indirectly conveyed here. Again, you could, on the one hand, you could say that a lot has really changed. Because if you think back of Germany before February 2022, the idea of cutting energy infrastructure from Russia, the idea of sending weaponry, including heavy weaponry, to Ukraine, those ideas would have sounded as if they stemmed from a parallel universe, especially among political elites. And even Annalena Baerbock, the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, was very reluctant at first towards sending weapons to Ukraine. So this one can acknowledge. However, the picture is not 100% rosy, so to speak. There are still, first of all, whilst 54% of Germans support sending tanks to Ukraine, 40% oppose it. And in a survey which was conducted in January, even around 37% claimed that this is not our war. There are still important institutions and social movements, such as Ostermärsche or open letters, which are signed by public intellectuals who claim that in the name of we German intellectuals think that Ukraine ought not to get weapons because we are for peace. That's the very simplified, primitive version of it. And it's also another interesting point that Scholz always clings to the notion of Russia must not win the war, but to this day he has not once said that Ukraine must win it. One could say that this is a philosophical, subtle difference, but it actually is very rich in consequences if you think of it, because one could interpret this as a decision to send enough weaponry for Ukraine so that it is somehow able to push back Russia. but no more. And here, of course, question to you. I would like to invite you to another discussion. What do you think are the main driving forces behind this? Is it mostly those old, outdated ideas of pacifism still dominating the mind of pundits and political elites? Or is it some kind of hesitancy? Or is it just still sticking to this idea to have special relationships with Russia because we can't anger them too much? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think maybe this is like the understanding that, for example, total Ukrainian win means complete reconstruction, destruction, decolonization, you name, of Russia. And it means that Russia should be treated in some way that it stops. So maybe it could be this mass bombardment that was in 45, yes, which is not like on the table, yes, but I think that somewhere we understand that to stop this war and to stop Russia and prevent Russia from, I don't know, licking its wounds and gaining more power to bring more war, is to destroy the whole system completely. And it's a big decision to make, and no one wants to say it loud, and no one wants to take responsibility for putting this on the table. Maybe that is because at the end, this is what we all are waiting for, obviously. But well, it's like the most core point of this. So that's why it's too radical, not too much.
In my opinion, Scholz doesn't want to reconstruct the geopolitical landscape of Europe. Just want to go back to the situation before the war and to secure relations with Russia in the long run. So.
With this last statement, Russia must not win the war, but what about the Ukraine? In the text of Timothy Snyder that we had to read for today, this topic is elaborated on Germany's historical responsibility for Ukraine and not fully recognizing the subjectivity or autonomy historically in the longer past. So yeah, one of the comments is what you've been showing this whole pacifism notion, but another one is the treatment of Ukraine as a state and nation within Europe by Germany.
So, I mean, one of the factors might be a disconnect between the political elite and society. And I'm not talking about Germany because I'm not an expert on German society, but when I look into the reactions from the Western states to the full-scale war, after February in 2022, I see that political elites finally, I think, understood, at least I hope, what Russia is and what it is doing. But the problem is that the logical consequence of jumping in would mean a colossal changes to the society also in the way Western societies live. And that's very unpopular. Basically, it's almost like a one-way ticket of losing the next election, and that might be one of the problems. So in other words, when we ask whose war it is, probably many people still, even in Poland, but the further west probably we go, the less likely people will say that it's also our war. So even if political elites understand that we should have sent tanks, jets, everything a year ago, almost like 10 months ago, so we would avoid, the carnage and Ukrainians dying. We are prepared. I mean, politically, it's much more, let's say, feasible to send it once every now and then, and it prolongs the war. But it's not. Excuse me, like you said, it does not really allow Ukrainians to get an upper hand to defend themselves. And I don't want to say, I don't want to sound cynical. I don't think that the West did not do anything. I think that the war, the way it's fought, apart of course of the bravery of the Ukrainians, is partly successful because of the Western response. It's not 2014. But again, I think that the shock is not felt in some of the Western societies enough to actually back it with let's say, more decisive actions, of course, without stepping one, crossing the red line.
It's interesting because you mentioned they should have done it like a year earlier, but if we think about 2014, and if you have read the book by Oksana Zabushko, which is translated into many languages, which is called The Longest Journey, what she said, that Putin came to Ukraine in 2014 not to start the war, but to actually end it. Because the war started from the moment Ukraine gained independence. But the independence was like a gift. Here you go, have it. What do we do with that? So I'm thinking, back in 2014, what did the world do? The world was watching, where Russia was the subject, and Ukraine was something in the middle, something like a gray zone. There's something going on there, let's just watch. And these words, never again, we see that, in fact, in 8 years' time, what happened in February made the situation twice worse. And it's not just our war, because does the war influence the rest of the world? Yes. Does the war questions the principles, the geopolitics, and the bigger picture of the world? Yes. And as long as we come to this atomically induced apocalyptism, I wrote it down, because the nuclear power, it's in the air, and it's like the Black Maiden, you know. And the moment the nuclear power is on the table, it's not just our war, because we handed it back. Yeah, we were forced to. And yes, it's about the Ukrainian state being a subject, definitely. Because I heard you say that Germany wants to have a bad dialogue with Russia, and a bad dialogue is better than no dialogue at all. So what about having a dialogue with Ukraine? What about placing Ukraine as a subject? What about asking, you know, Ukraine?
I also can judge how, like for example, Marius reading, so the Minister of Culture of Germany, and they still want to fund Russian initiatives and activities, and really a lot of money comes even more to this organization. And I have a lot of conversation with activists from Belarus based in Germany, but now, for example, living in Ukraine, who are pro-Ukrainian, but they were begging to take like this money to make something together, because for them it's they still don't, as I felt, don't ready to lose this connection, which is really deep, like, and also they think through these connections with sometimes with Russian activists, but also it gives them a chance to like some rehabilitation and also build like the culture. So still, they said that it's, I don't know, maybe also can ask people from Germany that it's really hard to avoid like these financial sources which will go to the Russian institutions, and it's really representative, and like how we can speak about political like questions and weapons to Ukraine, and even funds to like Russian institutions who still product propaganda like going on.
Then you.
Germany is actually, given the history of Germany, is a really pacifist country, and pacifism is inherent in Germany, in German society. And it's not a problem, but the problem is that today Russia is using it. Like yesterday again there was another open letter by Alice Schwarze and Sarah Stabina, like again, let's negotiate, let's stop the war. And they will have a march on the 25th of February. And the problem with German pacifism is, as Joschka Fischer put it, like, it's a bit childish. It's like, if we say never genocide again, then the genocide stops. Unfortunately, it does not stop. And if you say, like, stop war in Ukraine, the war doesn't stop because you're saying it. So, the problem with Russia is that like it should be responsible pacifism, and again it deals with pacification. So if there is aggressive state, there is a victim, like there should be some actions taken. And in this case, it's pacifism is about not taking responsibility and saying, well, the fact that genocide took place is of course a bad thing, but we have no connection to it, we are not responsible at all, so it's not our problem, and that's the problem of that like group of people who committed the genocide. So I know that there is a very good case of Green Party that was very pro-pacifism, and now they have really good position on the Russian-Ukrainian war, and like it would be really good if German society and politicians they like explain that there is no like black and white. Like if you close the eyes, everything stops. So there should be more explanation of the nature of this war, like that you cannot just stay aside and hope that everything will end in a positive conclusion.
Can I just add one important thing? Because if we talk about the word peace, I remember the definition, it's the end state. It's not the end state. Because if we want the Russian peace, let's think about the word occupation. Because the word comes down, finally, the war is over, it's peace. Whew, no more news, no more heated, terrible things on TV. I can just watch my favorite show. Has anyone ever thought of the people who stayed on the territories where Russians came and occupied? Are you worried about that? Do you can you at least imagine what kind of terrible things are happening to women, senior people, men, children, animals, everyone there on the occupied territory? So where is the ethical question here? The peace above all, or can it be questioned because there's occupation and it's something you don't want to know nothing. You want to know nothing about it. Sorry, emotional.
Depends how you define the peace, because for me, peace will be when Ukraine win the war. So yeah, if Ukraine wins the war, then
we will have peace.
I mean,
yeah, but that's
it can be an end state, but not in the
peace.
Western European countries' idea.
For this notion, like for the peace, as a peace and conflict student, like there is positive and negative peace. And what if we're talking about there is no war, that's negative peace. So negative, that means absence of violence, and positive, that's what we should be striving for. Exactly, like including everyone, making inclusive society. So we not only think about those ones who are now occupied, for sure that's really important, but also like I would say that we lost a big part of population who have been under occupation for many years, and they do not consider, like many of them do not consider themselves anymore part of our world, like our society, and that's a big problem because we can finish the actions, like military actions, but kind of this fixed column, as we say, like another supporters, the same like here, what you said about this letter again, like they still continue doing something, trying to say to the world, no, it's not like this, like we have another thing, like this reality is different. I mean that the idea is that, like as I see it, like now there is kind of battle between like two realities, and people like divide themselves into these realities and which reality they accept. And I mean that like, and you said that like now, if Germany would really be more decisive in giving response, they would destroy all the system. And I mean that like keeping the status quo, I think was the most important thing. Because if we see, like it was on the slide, like we saw the Afghanistan, we saw, like even before, like still, like Korea, the Vietnam, like still these wars, I mean that what is important for them, that they were fought. That if anything happened there and people died, it know how affected the life of people, and this Wirtschaftswunder, like the miracle, the economical miracle of Germany, I mean that they continued working, they continued rebuilding the society, they continued rebuilding the country. But what was happening there, that's why like we are really like preoccupied with that. But now it came so close, even like Balkan, yes, it was also so close. But now it's exactly about this structure. And probably if Germany will start reacting on that, kind of the place of the leader of the, like, will be lost. Because probably if it will go to the meaning of Ukraine, it means those countries that support Ukraine, and Germany is one of them, but not to probably that like extent that we want. Probably Germany will not be there, like in those leaders, because we see the process of the like peace, these negotiations, this that was happening from 2014. Germany was part of it, and if now like Germany will openly enter the war, that means that what was done before, that's just like it was a big mistake. So I mean that like. Probably, like, because we never know the right answer, I mean. But anyway, that's one part of it. Because then it would be a big mistake. And it didn't even start 2014. It started not even with independence, it started even before. Like, the...
Hundreds of years.
Yes, hundreds of years, yes. But just like that, I think not correct to think that, okay, we just started to have problems with Russia, like, with the independence. No. Like, it was earlier.
It's also about stating the aging. So he talks about Russia and now the Ukraine. So the more, who are you mentioning the more, is more Asian and more Russian figures. So Russia must not win the war, but it can stay, how it is, I don't know, change the regime, Navalny, blah, 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 and something like that. So Russia is still like #1 priority in public speaking, and Ukraine is like the instrument making this happen. So it also matters who are you talking about in the public.
Yeah.
I'm also a little bit surprised that the idea of the right to self-defense has not been raised like here, because for me that's the basic thing that appears here. And so if we are not using this idea in this discussion, probably, I mean, not in our discussion, but in general, there's a big discussion about pacifism. Whereas probably pacifism does not stand contradictory to the right to self-defense. But but in order to like make the division and not to use the idea of right to self-defense, we need to draw division between the ones who are defending themselves and us as being the others who are not in the conflict. And so as said earlier, there is a big difference, like geographical difference, between areas in which this war is perceived as our war, which I think, in, like, for instance, in Poland, is really, I mean, automatically it just happens. And Western Europe, the less our war is that.
And also the timing, because, for example, if Russia started full-scale invasion in 2014, it will be a whole different thing. I probably wouldn't be sitting here anyway, but so I think it was also like, I think now there will be war in Moldova, in more Georgia, Kazakhstan, I don't know, somewhere else. So it's also because, no, Poland is a part of NATO, so it's actually like Poland is not where they're going for, but still it's also the timing, because Ukraine were less Asian and less institutions, we were very weak, we didn't have the proper army, we didn't have the proper cultural institutions who are voicing out and backing these diplomacy things. So it's also about the timing, not only because I think that also, I don't know, both Balkans maybe the whole other thing, because no one clearly understands what's happening currently in the bigger scale, yes, in the mainstream media, for example, everyone is very confused about Balkans. But it's also about the timing.
Another thing that I also meant by what I was saying is that the big discussion whether in terms of pacifism shall we go to the war or take part in this war or not is relevant only if we are not thinking in the way of that we are in the war because we are self-defending to get to Ukraine. Because there is a general us between us here and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Go on, no, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Lucy, I mean, for me, like the striking figures are like those, the rest remains ambivalent, like of the German population, and of course, like the repeatedly like omission of Ukraine as a subject, and like we were speaking about, like I think the closeness, the proximity actually, it's striking, and I would even argue that like there's a problem actually of hearing or listening to the voice of the Ukrainian people simply because we didn't hear it, and that's that we can say like was an omission of like German society for tens of years, maybe longer, but also a kind of, let's say, lack in building the right institutions, like the networks, actually to allow this to happen. I mean, yes, for me the difference of how Polish people are reacting to the war since 2014 actually, and Germany, like my peers on Facebook, even like sharing, not sharing certain topics, it's amazing, and I'm just realizing, yes, it's about like feeling actually, like this closeness feeling that it's touching upon your lives. Like most of my Polish friends, they have relatives, they have connections, they work, and they are working with Ukraine, whereas like German partners, people, they don't have those bonds. So for me, it's like really the question of raising like the awareness of, yes, sorry to be like very stupid, there is something as Ukraine which has to be said out loud, I think. There's something as a specific cultural voice, and something we have finally to recognize, so that we can actually like feel this proximity.
Mm-hmm.
Probably I just said exactly what she said. Like I was just thinking that already times changed so much that we already forgot about the time when going abroad and you say you're from Ukraine, people just start to sing, and then they say, Russia. Like we already forgot this time because now already no one asked that, but it was the time that, and I'm sure that everyone remembers that. And like, I mean that probably those who are ambivalent, they still probably consider Ukraine being kind of like a rebel part of Russia that just somehow wanted to be independent, like out of nothing, and because like it was the time for even like for Germany, I mean it was a lot of changes at the end of like beginning of 90s, like the end of 80s. So kind of like this notion still, like I just remember what she said exactly, that kind of many people perceive Ukraine through looking at Russia or through thinking about Russia. So I mean that this is now changing because like also as you said that like working, cooperating with artists or with other scientists or like workers from Ukraine, that's already changing perspective. But unfortunately it doesn't go that fast.
It's so interesting because that's what we've been discussing at the breakfast today. Ukrainians, when they go into the world, they wear these bracelets which are the state symbol. It's a flag, and we sing the anthem, we identify ourselves, and basically each of us is screaming the subjectivity of Ukraine. We're saying we're independent. We've got the culture, the history, the language. Here are our state symbols. Please respect. Like we are here, we exist, we're not Russia, we're different. And the interesting thing is, it's what you said, Stepan. It's like, there's no Ukraine, but there is. And it's like you close your eyes and you try to, you live in a different reality, and that's what you said. There's an idea, the imagination, something that lives in my head, and this harsh reality. And what kind of reality Russian people live in, through narratives poured by TV straight into their minds. It's a blurred reality. So I have no idea how they have ever get a chance to, to take off the glasses and see the reality.
We all have stereotypes, and we all should study ourselves how we stereotype someone. So it's like, I don't know, how stereotype Africa, how stereotype Middle East or something. So by doing it to ourselves too, we can understand why Germans do not see. Have you seen Syria? No, we haven't seen Syrian war. We were absolutely ignorant about it. So this is like lesson degree. So dismantling this structure of knowledge, how do we perceive news, how do we do that? We will understand more. So it's not not because like these are evil guys. Obviously, Russia is a perfect villain and everything. We always will be. But this is more discussion. We are not so angelic ourselves in terms of ignorance. So I think it's a very important thing of how do we do that. How do really Russian narratives and money influence us, and how is it? Well, because it really is an interesting thing. How much of real Russian money is in Germany, in media, in politics, in academia.
So can you just add one more? Like, I mean, there's this narrative of it being a geopolitical thing, like Germany and Russia like still trying to secure the gas supplies, but for me it's like the narrative of it actually being kind of war very often in the field of culture and language is so important. Like not only like Putin's Russia like negating, denying Russia's or Ukraine's identity, Ukraine's language, etc. But yes, at the same time, like Germany, very broadly speaking, like not realizing, let's say, the cultural differences, the cultural identity of Ukraine, and so on.
But I think now
it's
more because
of course
there was a big job done by everyone. And more country. Ukraine has more voices, and maybe it's more distinguished now. Maybe less than we thought. It's hard.
Yeah, but there are those myths, you know, when they say, but you speak Russian in Ukraine, so what's the problem?
Well, we do the bilingual.
Nobody knows that people were physically killed in order to destroy the Ukrainian language. The Russian language was imposed, brutally imposed. This is not our native language. And you pick up language in the surroundings. Yeah, that's a different issue, but language is important. I'm sorry.
I would also say that there is like I mean, in my generation is also a high anti-American imperialism, and I think that's also why a lot of people are more like pacifism in this term, because they're like more try to understand, okay, what's going on with NATO and Russia, and I think also there's a high problem with disinformation. I wrote an essay about disinformation campaign from Russia about Ukraine since 2014, and it's really interesting because when I remember this time, I was little, but I can remember that there was, I think it's a really it is a different situation because you have like we called Euromaidan, I don't know how to call it in Ukraine, and there were like people in this movement who were like radical right wing, but there was just a minority. But in the media, they got really high. A lot of people looked at them, and also the Russian disinformation made them really big, and so I think it still have influence of the few now, or like the last year. I think it was because it was always like the dialogue about maybe also the separatists in the east part of Ukraine. And a lot of people, I think, don't understand how it. I think there's a lot of disinformation and a lot of
education.
Yeah, the education about Ukraine and all the revolution in 2013. I think there is a lot of people don't know actually what happened and what are the reasons, and I think that's the most problem in Germany, but also in France or a lot of Western countries. Yeah, I don't know.
Also, like this problem also very visible when I work with organizations who work with human rights in Germany, like based in Berlin, and we started the project connected to the invisible protest, digital protest, and we were supposed to work with activists and artists from Belarus, but then the projects were started, like full-scale work, so we changed the strategy and the idea of the project. But our partners from Berlin. So still Ukrainians and people from Belarus were involved, and they forced us to use the strategy of facilitation of conversation with people from Belarus, and they always wanted to show us as a very successful strategy to fight with press, and they always wanted to avoid aggression, as I said. And we had also once facilitated conversation when the facilitator from Germany, who used to work with people from Belarus, she asked one of the Ukrainian participants to imagine that she is Russian and how she will act in this situation. And it was a few months before, maybe in autumn previous year. So and still very powerful way for Germans, human rights activists, to cooperate with people from Belarus and to empower themselves in their beliefs of successful possibility to use these peaceful strategies. And as it was a few years ago when in Armenia we organized a big conference for countries from Eastern Europe, and Armenia peaceful protest was a best example of the successful solution of the political conflicts, and in the perspective when the activists from Russia and from Kazakhstan and Armenia were presented, case of Ukraine in 2018 was not very successful for them in this way.
And now Americans find Armenia incredible.
Yes, yes. So it was really strange to hear all this stuff.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this discussion. I really appreciate it. You raised so many interesting points. One point which you mentioned, and I also think is really worthwhile paying attention to, is this little agreement, little disagreement between you on the notion of peace, because I think that's also something that goes back to even Michel Foucault and stuff like this battle for political ideas. And there's a famous interview with Margaret Thatcher when she was asked what she perceives to be her biggest achievement. And her response was New Labour, because she has created a situation where even the opposition had to adopt her language in order to be still politically viable. And I think that's, in a way, I don't think that either of you are right or wrong, but I think it just describes the nature of the battlefield of ideas. And we are slowly coming to the end. This was two more points which I wanted to mention here, because the thing is, in theory, let's imagine we would try to explain all these in-depth points which you raised here to someone who has no deep knowledge about Ukraine and the history of Russia, and is simply kind of fooled by the allure of, let's call it, false pacifism. So, of course, having a discussion purely based on values and philosophical ideas is usually the most problematic thing, because in fact usually there's no final answer. But what is possible is analyze both parties of the political discourse and conflict, and compare their expertise, their empirical grounding, and whether their predictions have proven to be true in the past. And I think that is also something worth pointing out about the, as I called them here, new pacifists, including the two women on the picture who are, Stepan, tell us again who it is, because you just mentioned it. Yes, yeah. So on the one hand, a feminist iconic figure who embodies the feminist revolution in Germany like hardly any other activist or woman, and a very leftist politician. And the thing is, I've presented them here, but if you look at the names who have granted their names for these so-called open letters, who are asking for peace, so-called, there are no Ukraine experts at all there. Like, they're usually these either public intellectuals or celebrities, and this is not to say that such people should have no voice in the public discourse, but it is striking that there are no Ukrainian experts among them. And the second point is, I think this is, frankly speaking, one of the most annoying things is that if some of those proponents would at least openly claim that we are not deeply interested in the situation in the East, we just want our short-term peace here and now. But there's very often also this idea that, no, we are kind of expressing our position, and by doing so, we are actually supporting Ukrainians because we know better. We know better what's good for them than the Ukrainians themselves. Like that is a thought figure which reoccurs and reappears disturbingly often. And it's also interesting, like if you see the book cover in the middle, it's a book named Endspiel Europa, co-authored by Ulrike Guerreau. She used to be like the big hero of European salons in 2015 and 2016 when she published her book on the European Republic. So she was like a, you could say, hardcore European utopianist. And here she goes publishing a book which is probably the most revisionist, even confronted or compared to other important authors from the so-called New Pacifists. So this again tells you something about these relations which we discussed before. And lack of realism. So this is the picture of Professor Johannes Warwick, who is actually a pretty prominent political scientist, always been also a pretty outspoken supporter of the transatlantic alliance. And the thing with him is, check his Twitter if you haven't done so already. He's like really dogmatically clinging to this idea of let's finally start with negotiations. Like no matter what begins, people are even making memes with him as the main character. And what is interesting about him is I think he also embodies a deeper problem. Because again, I mean, there's no such thing as analyzing reality without theory and certain assumptions, and it is better to be aware of them. But the point is also, like, his example also reminds me of, for instance, Professor John Mearsheimer, is that there's this, again, a line of thinkers who have no real empirical grounding as far as Ukraine and Russia is concerned, but they are deeply in love with their theorems. So in this case, it's realism in international relations, which sort of assumes that states are more or less agents and functions of the relations around them, and wouldn't even, like, at least classical form of realism has a hard time to really reflect internal changes and also the arbitrary idea of policies, right? There's no such thing as automatism. You can think of you can strive to be successful by having a large GDP, by being a very innovative country and not be interested in territorial conquest anymore. Or, like Russia, you can do poorly on all those fronts and thus focus on this very classical territorial expansion. So all these dimensions, they are lacking here, and yeah, that's also an important feature of the New Pacifists. And we're coming to an end now. Each of you will have your own conclusion. I would say with alluding to the first slide where we discussed like the crisis of peace or crisis of pacifism. I mean, the notion of crisis itself, as many historians have pointed out, actually stems from the medical discourse, and originally it meant that you are in a critical condition out of which you will either survive and come out strengthened, or you die. And I think that February 2022, in fact already 2014, has shown that some ideas simply don't work, and that crisis can be a good thing, because maybe this is necessary for progress of understanding. And this includes, again, the never again, which we discussed here, which I think is constantly evolving, and maybe we understand now much better what it truly means compared to 30, 40 years ago. So that was it, an introductory session. Hopefully it got you going a little bit, and thank you so much for your time and attention. I really appreciated this great discussion. Thank you.